Do I even dare ask about an atypical day?
Well, I'll tell just a brief story about a case I worked on. There was a woman who took her car. I know you've heard this one because I told you before, but a woman took her car. She was a librarian, and she took her car in to have the tires rotated. And it was a big national chain that she took it to. I can't say the name, non-disclosure agreements and all that, but she took it in, her tires were rotated, she picked up the car an hour later and drove away, and 20 minutes later her right front wheel fell off. And she was on the highway at that point. She slammed into a bridge abutment and was paralyzed from the waist down. And the chain of auto places was offering her $400,000 as settlement, which was a bad joke. Her medical bills were already $400,000 easily. She was going to have her bungalow retrofitted so that she could live in a wheelchair. She was going to have, physiotherapy, and lots of medical bills as her life went on. But they knew that her health insurance sucked and her benefits were about to max out. And so they just figured she'd be under pressure and she'd settle. They also knew that she didn't have a perfect driving record. She'd been in a few accidents before, but this was clearly not her fault. And they just figured under the pressure, they would just be able to delay it and basically starve her out, and she would have to settle. And so her lawyer hired the firm that was contracting to me to find the mechanic who had gone missing. The mechanic who worked on her car lived in a little trailer park and had just disappeared. His trailer was empty, he was gone, no forwarding. So I tracked this guy down eventually, and he was in a neighboring state, staying in his mother's little cabin in the woods. And when I found him, what I found was, first of all, one of the things that I learned along the way is that he was not overtly negligent. He hadn't been drunk on the job or anything like that. He had been served divorce papers that morning, and he told his boss, and he said, I have to take the day off. And his boss said, no, you're working. You leave, you're fired. And so, he did what people who need their job do. He worked, and he was blinking back tears and just doing his job on autopilot. And he obviously screwed up, and it cost this woman the use of her legs. But he wanted to testify and tell the truth. He was petrified. The lawyers for this big chain of auto places had intimidated him. They were paying him money, cash money, just enough to live on, telling him to stay under radar, and they had promised that they would get him another job in one of their other franchises in California when it all blew over. Now, what the lawyers were doing was illegal. They could be disbarred for what they did. This man had been subpoenaed by a judge. He had to be deposed, and they were hiding a witness. That's illegal. They could be disbarred. They could go to jail for that. Eventually, we found him. He wanted to talk. We brought him in, and as soon as we let them know that we had him, they settled almost immediately the same day for $10 million. And but the moral of the story for me, as one of the things that was heartbreaking for me, is that in PI fiction, there's justice served at the end, ultimate justice. Everything gets resolved, and there's justice, and there's all those good things. And in reality, the real bad guys in this story were the boss who made the guy work when he couldn't, and the lawyers who broke every law in the book and every ethical standard of their profession to hide a witness. They should have been punished for that. They should have lost their law license for that, but they didn't, because in the end, the goal isn't ultimate justice. The goal is what your client needs, and what our client needed was money. And in order to get her the settlement, we had to all sign non-disclosure agreements and not follow any further. So, money talks, and there's a great deal of corruption in the way the system works, and that was a very strong lesson for me as a PI.
And was that Chicago or New Orleans?
That was in New Orleans.
So can you talk a little bit about the difference between Chicago and New Orleans? San Francisco is such a character in the Maltese Falcon, as Chicago is in your books, both of them being set in Chicago with the political corruption and the mafia being there and such a presence. Can you talk about the difference between Chicago and New Orleans?
Yeah, there's a great, he recently died, Studs Terkel, a great Chicago writer, who once said, Chicago is not the most corrupt city in America. It is the most theatrically corrupt city in America. And that's true. New Orleans is way more corrupt than Chicago. Yes, there's corruption in Chicago, but the police generally treated me well, with disdain. I was a 25-year-old kid who just started working as a PI. But they treated me with a certain degree of professionalism. They had their job to do. They had to work with me. I was, working properly under license, and they generally gave me enough cooperation. Not a lot, but enough. In New Orleans, it was a whole different thing. In New Orleans, the corruption was unbelievable. This is before Katrina. I can't speak to what the city's like now. I was there during Hurricane Andrew. But the police, a starting salary for a sheriff's deputy in Orleans Parish is $12,000, or what at the time was $12,000. You're not going to get professional police officers at $12,000. You're going to get either crooks who want badges, or you're going to get guys with the John Wayne fetish who want a badge and a gun, but you're not really going to get to the top of the drawer. And in New Orleans, the corruption was so small. For example, when you do a surveillance, another thing where the books often and movies often differ from reality, you'll see the PI parked on a residential street in his car staring at the house, waiting for something to happen. In reality, what would happen if you did that is, in an hour or two, some resident would call the cops and say, there's a guy sitting outside in a car, he's been there for hours. And the next thing you know, there'd be a prowl car coming up behind you, and your surveillance would be blown. So in reality, what you do is you go to the nearest police station and you sign in with them. And you say, I'm going to be conducting a surveillance tonight on the 600 block of such and such a street. And invariably, the cops say, who's the target of your surveillance? And you say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to tell you that. And they say, who's your client? I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to tell you that. And you go through that little dance, and then you go do your thing. And so I did this in New Orleans, having done it in Chicago and thinking that's the way it works. And I get there, and I'm sitting there, and I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. And a couple hours later, the blue lights come behind me. And the cops pull me out of the car. Now my surveillance is completely blown. This is a prowl car which has been driving around prowling for hours. The hood is very hot. They are pressing my face against the hood. When they search me, they are groping pretty hard. And they're obviously sending a message. So I'm phoning the investigation firm that I was working for and saying, hey, these guys are doing this to me. And he said, oh, come on, this is how it works down here, man. This is what you do. Next time you go in, you walk in, you sign in, you do everything you normally do, except at the end, just before you leave, you get a big bottle of Jack Daniels, the big handle bottle. And you get one of those, and you put it on the counter, and you say, oh, by the way, I just found this outside by the curb. I don't know whose it is. Maybe the owner will come claim it. Maybe you guys can find a home for it. And you leave. And I was amazed, and I did it, and sure enough, they didn't come and bug me that night. And I thought, it's one thing to be corrupt, but they're corrupt for a bottle of Jack Daniels. I mean, it's so cheap. And that's a big difference between New Orleans and Chicago to me.